The Tale of the Time-Stopping Spell. In the magical world of Kotlin, wizards and witchers often found themselves performing tasks that took a long time, like brewing a potion or summoning a creature. While waiting for one task to complete, they wished they could pause and perform other tasks without any delay. This is where the Suspend spell came into play. The Suspend keyword is akin to a time-stopping spell. When invoked, it allows the caster, so the function, to pause its execution without blocking the entire magical ritual thread, so the main thread, the UI thread. Once the long task is complete, the function can resume from where it left off. So in technical terms, non-blocking, a suspend function doesn't block the thread it's running on, but instead it suspends the coroutine's execution. When the result is ready, the coroutine resumes. The coroutine context. So a suspend function can only be invoked from a coroutine or another suspend function. They are the heart of Kotlin's approach to asynchronous programming. Flexibility. While paused, the other tasks or functions can run, making better use of resources and improving responsiveness, especially in applications with a user interface. Okay, so this was just a little story. Now let's get back to our project and see how we can put those concepts into our app. Therefore, I will create a new file once again. So let's go ahead and create a new file, Kotlin file class, and this one will be just a file. Well, you could use an interface, but file should be fine. Let's just use a file, and I'm going to call this one API service, like so. And there we are. Now inside of this file, I want to create an interface. Now let's go ahead and create an interface using the interface keyword. We saw interfaces a tiny bit earlier. Now let's see how those interfaces are in action. So I'm creating this interface called API service. And what this interface will do is it will have one function. It will have a suspend function. Now this suspend function will have the name of getCategories, and it will return a categories response. So in order to get data, when calling a website, we need to use the get keyword. Now this @get allows us to use this, well, it comes from Retrofit to HTTP. So this get allows us to do an HTTP request. Now we need to say where this HTTP request should go to. And in our case, it should go to categories.php. Okay, now you see this import has been added to us because we use this @get. So where is this get or this categories PHP coming from? It basically comes from our TheMealDB API. So we have this website called categories PHP. So this is a PHP file, but that doesn't have to bother us. What we are interested in is just basically this endpoint. So the name of where we want to get or which file we want to get. So we want to get this file called categories PHP. And the other part is what we will define somewhere else. So the link is where we're going to use Retrofit to use this base URL, this one here, and then connect it to this categories PHP. Because we can potentially use this base URL for many other things later on as well, which is why we're going to use this approach. Now let's go back to our project. And now you see we will get the categories PHP. And what we will do with it is we will use the get categories to get category response. What is category response? Do you recall? Well, we had this data class that we called category response. We set that up, and what it contains is just a list of category items, because that's what we want to load from the API so that we can display it inside of our application. So now we're saying get the categories. This get keyword is used to specify the type of request that should be made to a particular URL. In our case, it's the categories PHP URL, which represents the endpoint where the get request will be sent. So the endpoint is basically the final part of a URL, if you will. And Retrofit uses these annotations, so this @sign, this @get for example, to generate the necessary code to make the network request, send the get request to the specified URL, and process the response data. And that's what this Retrofit does for us. We don't have to take care of this ourselves. Now let's talk about the suspend keyword. This suspend keyword, making calls to APIs, are said to be an expensive operation. This is because it could take longer than usual to display the data on the UI, on the user interface, depending on a lot of factors. For example, the internet speed, the size of the data, and so forth. Now, these kind of operations are processed asynchronously, which means that they're happening in the background, so to speak, to avoid boring the user during the waiting time. And that is where this suspend keyword comes in. It is a part of the Coroutine API that provide a straightforward and structured way to manage concurrency, basically running many or multiple tasks at the same time. Like the UI takes care of what, well, UI thread, so to speak, takes care of whatever should happen on the UI. But if we are running something on the UI thread that would take a lot of time, the UI would start freezing, and that's just not a good approach. And basically, you should never do that, which is why we use the suspend, which then allows us to run whatever slow calculations or slow things, or like execution of slow or long taking code, like loading data, because we don't know how long it's going to take. So the suspend function just says, okay, don't worry about me. I'll come back once I'm done executing. And then it runs in the background or waits for the responses, so to speak. Now, I use this keyword coroutines. Now let's look into coroutines a little more. Coroutines are a powerful and lightweight concurrency framework in Kotlin, specifically designed for handling asynchronous and non-blocking operations, like our getting the categories from the web. They are often used to perform tasks such as making network requests, as I said, reading and writing to databases, or handling time-consuming operations without blocking the main thread, which is the UI thread. They promote efficient and responsive user interfaces by running potentially time-consuming operations in the background. So what will this keyword do to the get categories function? Well, it will process it on the background, keeping the interface responsive until the data is retrieved. So now that's just our interface. Now we need to actually finish the service, the entire call, so to speak. How can we set up a service? Well, let me show you. So we need to create a retrofit object, and therefore we are using, again, retrofit. Okay, we've seen retrofit before. Now this retrofit needs a few things. So there is this builder that we can use, and therefore we need to import retrofit. Let's import retrofit. You see, we imported the HTTP GET, which allows us to do HTTP requests, especially the GET request. There are also other requests such as POST. So we're just getting data, but if we were to share data to the web, we would need to use POST, which we don't do in this project. Then we need to build our retrofit URL, so to speak. And I'm using the base URL. And the base URL, I said it earlier, we will need to copy from the website, which is this part here. So this is the base link, the base URL that we need to use. So let's copy this piece and let's paste it in here. Let me just make it a little more visible here. So this is the base URL. Now we need to add something to it. So there is this dot that we can add. You can add it at the end, which is basically the same thing as we did here. So dot base URL. So it's like applying functions upon functions upon functions. As I said earlier, everything in Kotlin is an object, which allows us to call functions on objects, right? So here we are building based on the base URL plus the converter factory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a converter factory here, which uses JSON converter factory dot create. And then we are building it like so. Basically what this code does is it basically just says, okay, let's build a connection to this base URL and do it in a format so that we get, well, we can convert whatever we get into objects in Kotlin. Now I can do this by using a recipe service. I'm setting up a service based on that now. So I build this retrofit object, and now I'm going to create it using our API service that we set up. So here I need to use API service : class.java. And this basically says we want to have this service that allows us to get this categories PHP file, which then we will convert into JSON objects that we can then use. So a lot is going on here, just a few lines of code, but man, they are crazy efficient. So there's a lot going on in these few lines of code, but basically it just really allows us to go ahead with our application, get the data, and display the data later on. So this retrofit builder is responsible for preparing the endpoint and adding the JSON converter. It then provides the create method for gaining access to the service methods. So for example, our get categories. Okay, so this is the recipe service that we've set up, and we can set up multiple different services, but we are specifically interested in the API service where we can, for example, get the categories. Now, if we wanted to get other things, we would modify this interface, and that's what we're going to do later on in the course. But for now, this is what you need to get from it. So that's pretty much it for this video. See you in the next one.